General, you have seen this region transform over the last few decades. How would you characterize what we are seeing in this part of the world right now, particularly when it comes to the appetite to invest?
Well, it's exploded, really, is the only way to term that. The first time I was in here, I think, was something like 45 years ago. Actually, let me do the math here, and I'll start that over. So it was in late, 45 years ago. The first time I was in here, it was 45 years ago. I was the aide to the Chief of Staff of the U.S. Army as we were doing the buildup for what would ultimately be the liberation of Kuwait. Then many times back and forth. Ultimately, of course, I was out here in Iraq alone as a 2-star, 3-star, 4-star, then the Central Command, where you have the entire Middle East, Central and part of South Asia, and then Afghanistan, then CIA Director, and back out here quite a bit for that, and then, of course, since then with KKR. But in the past with KKR, we were raising money. Now we're investing money. I've seen this change literally, physically. Actually, where the water was in the past in Abu Dhabi is no longer where it was. They literally moved an entire new corniche. I think it was the Ritz-Carlton used to be beachfront property. Now you have to cross the road to get to it. So again, just amazing transformation. And even when you think Dubai is finally, this is it, and it just expands further. And that's the case all up and down the Gulf.
So how aggressive does the firm want to be in this region? And when you look at deploying capital into these transforming Gulf cities that you're talking about, how actually aggressive do you want to be? Is there a target that you want to spend?
We have targets. I don't want to get into them here, as you would imagine, but no, we're very aggressive. We have an investment team here for the first time. By the way, it's in Abu Dhabi. We also have offices in Dubai and Riyadh, and I think we'll expand those as well, and there could be other locations depending on the opportunities that we're able to realize in those locations. But again, this is a very different mindset from what we had in the past. I used to come in here with Henry Kravis, now with Scott Nuttall doing the annual road show, and then we get to 2 or 3 road shows and then all the other trips and so forth. So this is not just about a retired general who never turns down another title or another medal. This is about a serious intent and enormous capital behind it. Keep in mind, just in my time at KKR, over 12 and a half years now, we've grown from $83 billion under management to over $725 billion. And we have over $110 billion in dry powder right now, again, looking for investment opportunities. And we're putting that to work very aggressively.
Let's talk about that opportunity as well, because what we're seeing now is really new strategic alignments. We're seeing Gulf states balancing ties between Washington and Beijing and even Moscow. How do you see this multipolar reality reshaping the global investment landscape?
Well, I think the world has changed. And in fact, during the 12 and a half years that I've been at KKR, we tend to characterize the shift as one of going from a global situation that could be described as benign globalization, where all the barriers to trade, investment, capital flows, even data, intellectual property, and people were all being reduced. Globalization, as measured by global trade, was going up like this. And you would say that economics largely drove geopolitics. 12 and a half years later, geopolitics is back with a vengeance. The holiday from history, as they say, is over. This is partly from the continued rise and more aggressive activities by China on the world stage, Russian aggression, North Korea, Iran, all these other challenges that are out there that all make up what is much more of a multipolar world in a variety of different respects. Now all of those barriers that were being reduced have been going up, and it's not by any means just the tariffs announced by President Trump, plenty of others. President Biden put 100% tariffs on Chinese electric vehicles, limited the whole areas in which we could invest in China very substantially. So again, all of this is much, much more material. When Henry Kravis and George Roberts established the KKR Global Institute and asked me to chair it, I think a lot of companies looked around and said, what do you need, what's that for? Well, now they know what it's for, because geopolitics and the macro and public policy concerns are very much part of the diligence process. They're a formal piece of it now. And our job is to make sure that all the risks that we identify as a team can be mitigated sufficiently that they won't prevent a successful outcome. And that's a very, very important task in almost every deal now. even the deals in the United States, are affected by tariff rates, by restrictions, by all of these new developments in geopolitics that make investing much more challenging and much more complex.
And of course, this multipolar reality puts geopolitics, but also artificial intelligence at the center of the conversation as well. How do you see AI changing the global order?
Massively. And also the competition around AI. I think the general consensus, we track this very, very carefully. By the way, we are huge investors in the so-called enablers of AI. Data centers. We own over 200 data centers around the world, and somewhere around another couple hundred are literally being developed or envisioned, and being enabled by our investments. We're big in cooling systems, some in chip manufacturing, and then also in energy generation by all types, I might add, and also then the management of it and the transmission. These are, again, these are the picks and shovels of the modern day gold rush, which is, of course, the AI large language models. The general assessment, I think, is that the U.S. is still ahead in the AI world and in the chip world, if you will, if you tie in those from whom we import chips. But that applications actually are where China is outstripping the rest of the world. And again, this is a serious confrontation and competition. Because there are lots of restrictions now on what can be sold to whom. You just saw that President Trump made an exception now for NVIDIA, the highest chips and so forth. So this is another dimension of geopolitics, and it's a very, very important one because AI is going to transform everything. It already is. In fact, the U.S. here, I'd say perhaps more than any other economy, although China's also ahead in robotics and some others. But the U.S. innovation that is producing productivity gains that are very, very substantial, arguably the greatest in our lifetimes, that accounts for probably 0.9 of the 1.6% real GDP growth of the United States this year. So this is very, very significant, and it's accelerating in many ways. I asked actually it was one of the heads of Anthropic, which has the Claude LLM. It's one of the top 3 to 5 of all the LLMs that are out there. Said, put this in layman's terms. What is it? What level are the current LLMs? And he said, well, right now we have LLMs are roughly the level of a great graduate student, but less than a year, we're going to have an LLM that's greater than a good PhD, and within less than a year from that, it's going to be the level of a Nobel laureate. So again, this acceleration is very, very substantial, and I assume you have your own AI agent. I assume you've given him or her a name, and that you consult it regularly, and especially when you're feeling down, that it reminds you what a great strategic genius you've been over the time and all of the rest of it. Because, you know, they're massive suck-ups, these LLMs. but no, this is, and at KKR, we have a very aggressive program to identify applications, develop applications for AI in the firm, and saving countless man hours in a variety of different tasks that used to require humans and now can be done by machines.
General, you're someone who obviously thinks very deeply about the geopolitical impact of all of this as well. What is at stake, sir, in your view, if the United States does not win this AI marathon?
Well, it depends. You know, there's not going to be a winner and a loser. It's going to be relative degrees of dominance or excellence or what have you. And certainly whoever it is that does best is going to have a certain advantage in a number of different ways. By the way, that is in the military world as well. I go quite regularly to Ukraine. I just finished my 7th full week trip there since the full-on invasion in 2022 by Russia. And that is the future of warfare. And AI is already engaged in a whole host of different tasks and enabling the Ukrainians in particular, although the Russians have very substantial innovation as well. You know, this is really an unmanned systems battlefield. Certainly there are soldiers that rush across the street, try to get a new foothold, but tanks don't survive on this battlefield anymore, armored vehicles, all the rest of that. It's just this ubiquitous surveillance, and the minute one side or the other starts to try to conduct an attack, out come the suicide drones and so on. The Ukrainians are using 9,000 drones per day, and maybe a third or so of those don't come back. They're suicide drones intended to go out and strike something. They're not going to come back, or they're shot down. Because again, this is the most lethal front lines in the world. Well, AI is already enabling a lot of this, and you can see where it is going, because where the next step is you're no longer limited by the number of remote pilots that you have, because they're going to be algorithmically piloted, if you will. And then you can have swarms, and the dynamics of all of this are really quite extraordinary.
Let me ask you about something else that's happening in the United States right now as well, because you're, of course, head of the KKR Global Institute. You monitor geopolitics as a driver of markets here. When you first read the Trump administration's new national security strategy, what's the first thing that came to mind?
Well, I think certainly the focus on the homeland, the security of the United States, of our hemisphere, that's certainly much more prominent than it typically has been in a national security strategy. It's a little bit more of a manifesto and a lot of, but that's always the case. There's no real ends, ways, and means here. This is, again, a statement of principles and beliefs, if you will, that permeate this. This does this probably more than most that we have seen in the past. It's quite different in that regard from Trump 1.0, which was more of a traditional one. Certainly the exhortation for Europeans especially to do more for themselves, very prominent in there, although I'd also note then that anyone who's looking at that should then also read the new National Defense Authorization Act, which Congress influences, and there are numerous specifics in that reflect the continued commitment to the transatlantic relationship, to NATO, to maintaining our force levels, keeping the job of Supreme Allied Commander. So there's a dialogue that's ongoing inside Washington where Congress very much gets a vote. It's committing itself in this document, and I'd read that as I also read a document that is, in a way, going after the Europeans, but frankly, some of the Europeans needed to be gotten after, because I watched as 4 different presidents tried to exhort the Europeans to do more for their own defense. Now that's actually happening. And why is it? Well, it's a function of 2 leaders. One is President Putin and the threat that he represents to Europe, especially as now there's these activities going on inside their own airspace, not just in Ukraine, but then also the pressure from President Trump that has been very, very substantial, and he's gotten them to commit to what they should have done years ago, which is now to raise their spending for defense as a percentage of GDP from 2% to 3.5%, 5% if you take into account infrastructure. And that is good and long overdue. And you see that kind of sentiment reflected. You see, I think, continued commitment to this region. I think, frankly, the document is informed by the very good relations that he has with the leaders out here. That trip out here was a huge success, really, all around for all people. And then traditional commitment, I think, to Asia, recognizing that the most important relationship and competition in the world is that between China and the U.S. and our Western allies and partners.
Looking at the document more broadly as well, the administration argues that this is a return to peace through strength. But when you assess the threat landscape today, what is the single biggest issue facing the future security of the United States?
I think it is actually transforming our forces to ensure that we solidify deterrence in the Indo-Pacific region. Again, the most important relationship is that between China, U.S., and our allies and partners. We're all in this together. If you think, for example, of the U.S. as the guy in the circus who's keeping a bunch of different plates spinning simultaneously, and these plates represent threats, challenges, issues that we have to manage, confront, deal with, and so on. And we do it, again, with our allies and partners, and we should recognize their importance as we do this. The plate that represents the, again, China relationship with the U.S. and West, that plate is bigger than all the others in that particular tent. Don't get me wrong, I think we should have controlled immigration long before this administration. I think there are other issues in the homeland in our hemisphere that deserve more attention. But at the end of the day, the relationship that matters most is that with China, and this is accurately described, I think, by President Biden's National Security Advisor, Jake Sullivan, as severe competition. We need to make sure that severe competition never evolves into actual military confrontation. And the way you do that is by ensuring that the elements of deterrence, there's 2 of them, potential adversaries' assessment of your capabilities on the one hand, and your willingness to employ them on the other, that these are rock solid. Well, we have to make sure the capabilities side is reflecting lessons that we should be learning in Ukraine. That is the future of warfare right now, and you can see where it is headed in a variety of different ways. As I mentioned, you'll see over time less reliance on remote pilots, greater reliance on algorithmic pilots, if you will, and what that enables you to do in terms of many, many more times the drones at one time. We need to be learning and then reflecting that in our force structure. I'm actually heartened to see the attention that's being given to this by those in the Pentagon, trying to drive innovation much more rapidly in the past, but noting that, look, we have a military-industrial congressional complex in which there are elements that want to buy more of what we already have. They have a vested interest in the status quo, the current basing arrangements, and all the rest of this. And so we need to accelerate the pace. We need to accelerate the shipbuilding program, for example. I was just in Seoul and discussing that kind of, there's a partnership that looks very, very likely there. I was in Tokyo talking about, again, what lessons should be learned by their military from Ukraine. But we have to lead that in the United States, and over time shift from what, this is very simplistic, but it gives you the idea, from a small number of large platforms to a massive number of unmanned systems that increasingly will not just be remotely piloted, but will be algorithmically piloted. If you want to actually operationalize the vision that the Indo-Pacific commander, Admiral Petraeus, has laid out publicly of turning the Taiwan Strait into a hellscape, you've got to have massive numbers of undersea unmanned systems on the surface, in the air, on the ground, even in outer space, cyberspace, the cognitive. You can keep going with these domains, but that's what we need to do, and we need to do that a lot more rapidly than we are right now.
The Trump administration is also attempting to negotiate an end to Russia's war in Ukraine. Are you encouraged by the pace and tone of talks so far, and when and how will this war eventually come to a close?
Well, I'm encouraged that there is an effort, spurred by the United States and backed by President Trump personally in many respects and his direct negotiators, to try to bring the war to an end. I'm not encouraged by Moscow's response. Vladimir Putin just continues to reiterate that his goals are the maximalist objectives he's held all along, which essentially denies independence to Ukraine. He wants to get a pro-Russian president to replace President Zelensky. By the way, the irony, he says it must denazify. President Zelensky is Jewish. There's a little bit of irony there. He wants to demilitarize Ukraine, at the very least hold its numbers in military down to 600,000 or less, far less than what they have right now on the battlefield. He wants to be given ground that is the most fortified area of Ukraine. It's called the fortified cities, in fact, that he hasn't even been able to get forces to, much less actually take. I mean, and the losses on the Russian side are just, again, I can't actually comprehend them. But he wants all of these objectives, and he is not going to budge, I don't think. Ukraine has shown some willingness to negotiate. They have to have red lines too, though. In fact, the president of Ukraine is legally prevented from actually giving land to another country or redrawing the country's borders. They actually have to take that to a vote by the people. So he's not even allowed to do that. And then it would be foolhardy of them to agree to some of the other Russian demands, especially if there's not corresponding security guarantees that are absolutely rock solid. In my view, Russia is actually more vulnerable now than I think most people realize. They run out of money in their what's called their National Welfare Fund sometime next year. That's what they're diverting to keep their military-industrial complex going. They've taken losses that are greater in killed and wounded than the U.S. took in all of World War II. Again, think about this. And this is we were in all of the different theaters of war at that time. 1.2 million killed and wounded. That is not sustainable. And they're starting to see the challenges in recruiting. They're also starting to find it more difficult to find the money that has been the incentive, these huge bonuses for enlisting. We're seeing the shortcomings in how they train and integrate soldiers. The Ukrainians have told me that they've actually detained soldiers that were in the Army, not in their unit, in the Army less than 2 weeks. So that's a very slapdash basic training, shall we say, immediately put and then thrust into the offensive operation, told run across the street and try to establish a foothold in that building. So again, I think there is an opportunity here, especially in this case. This is about Europe. This is a really key moment. If they can, in their meeting in mid-December, finally approve using the frozen Russian reserves in European banks, somewhere around $200 to $250 billion equivalent, as collateral for Euroclear bonds that they give to Ukraine, essentially cash. It's a loan, but it's zero interest, and they don't have to repay it until Russia pays them reparations. That actually is a game changer. We've heard a lot of game changers before. I've never bought into those, but M1 tanks, the F-16, the multiple launch rocket system, Army tactical missile system, all of these, they are great additional enablers, but they're not game changers. $200 billion or even 100 billion euros of money for Ukraine would be a game changer. It solves their fiscal and economic problems for a couple of years, and they could double the production of drones from 3.5 million per year. That's what they're doing right now. By the way, the U.S. produces all of 300,000 per year right now, from 3.5 million per year to 7 million. And among these are the most sophisticated drones in the world. These are better than what we have, frankly, elsewhere in the world. And they now even have a long-range surface-to-surface cruise missile that they built that has got a much longer range, 3,000 kilometers, and a much bigger warhead that then does the Tomahawk cruise missile that we've been dithering about whether or not to provide to them. So that enables them to put more pressure every night on Russia. They've been going after their refineries, their fuel storage locations. Russia, meantime, is trying to turn out the lights and turn off the heat in Ukraine. Terrible. I'd love to see this come to an end, which is what is animating the White House without question. But I don't see the flexibility in Vladimir Putin, and therefore what should be done is to enable Ukraine to get Putin to a point where he realizes that his forces need a cessation of hostilities and then might actually come to the bargaining table. By the way, then, to make sure that it's a durable agreement, there should be absolutely ironclad security guarantees, Article 5 like, or even better, because Article 5 says, you know, attack on one is an attack on all, but you get to choose how you respond. This should be very, very clear to Ukraine and to Russia so that there's an actual deterrent aspect to this, and there's no question about it. We did not do enough in the wake of the 2014 occupation of Crimea and seizure of the southeastern part of Ukraine, and that's why Putin had the confidence to resume and do it even bigger, of course, with the full-on invasion of 2022.
Let me ask you about something that's happening closer to the region here as well. You, of course, moderated this very high-profile interview with Syria's President Ahmed al-Sharaa. The optics of that meeting, to my mind, represented a really seismic shift, and this is something that we continue to see over the last couple of weeks as well. What does this tell you about Syria's reintegration into the region and indeed the global order? And do you trust Ahmed al-Sharaa?
Well, first and foremost, this was a seismic change because Syria essentially went from being an ally of Iran and a transit for Iranian weapons to go across Iraq, through Syria, on the ground, and then down into southern Lebanon to Hezbollah. Hezbollah has been beat up very badly by the Israelis, who began that with the most unbelievable intelligence supply chain operation where thousands of pagers blew up in the faces of the leaders of the Syrian, blew up in the faces of Hezbollah leaders, decimating the entire leadership structure, not just decapitating it. And then they took it down from the air with some limited ground operations. Now, Iran cannot reconstitute Hezbollah by doing what they used to do, just driving across Syria and very easily getting the weapons into their hand. So that's a very significant development. And of course, you saw the recognition of that because you had individuals like Crown Prince Mohammed bin Salman in Saudi Arabia asking President Trump to meet with Ahmed al-Sharaa, which he did when the leaders were all here, or were all in Riyadh. This is, again, a very big development. The question, though, and the question I asked him and somewhat suggested the answer to, is, can you build a government that is representative of all the elements in a country through which just about all of the ethnic, sectarian, and tribal fault lines of the Middle East run, and ensure not just majority rule, but minority rights. And that is a huge task. And I think the jury is still out, and it should be out. You know, do we trust Ahmed al-Sharia? I don't think you should. It's neither yes or no. It is, let's see what he's doing. And there are actually, in the congressional language that lifts the Caesar sanctions on Syria, there is supposed to be an assessment of how he's doing at certain intervals to see whether that should be reimposed or not. I'd like to see him given every opportunity to succeed. So I applauded when President Trump lifted the bounty on his head and a few other of the restrictions. Then, as Congress has lifted the Caesar sanctions, but it's again, don't trust, verify. That was the old Reagan statement, I think, when he was asked, do you trust the Soviets to live up to this latest arms control agreement? Don't trust, verify.
As you write, he has gone from cell block to statesman in the region. One of the other key questions, though, is the barriers that he is ultimately going to face. Is democracy the right answer for Syria?
Yeah, it's a very, very good question, because we have seen efforts to help democracy build, and in some cases it's gone reasonably well. In some other cases it has failed miserably. There was a famous Princeton professor, and that's where I did my PhD, of course, Bernard Lewis, who used to say, and he was an Arabist, he was highly respected in that regard, and he used to say democracy is strong medicine in the Middle East. It should be administered small doses at a time. I don't know whether I'd go that far, but it is a good caution. We saw that out of all the Arab Spring countries, there was only one where we saw actually a democracy, and frankly, that is no longer as robust, if you will. That was Tunisia, where now there's a degree of authoritarianism back. Libya is still a fractured country, still to a degree. It's not a full-on civil war, but clearly differences of a very substantial nature that prevent it from coming together. Syria, we'll see. I would be happy just to see a body that, again, has representation from all the people of Syria, where there are minority rights as well as majority rule. Iraq, interestingly, actually that democracy is functioning. In fact, I was there for the first time since I was CIA director just a few weeks ago. I was astonished by all the work that's been done in Baghdad in particular. The infrastructure is just amazing. It's been huge progress in so many different respects. But this latest election, I'm sure there's going to be months and months and months of wrangling before they can finally get a coalition that can equal the number of seats that are required for a prime minister. And in that, there could be very substantial Iranian influence still, which is a real cautionary tale.